Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with a video that is all about my favorite nonfiction. I thought in honor of Nonfiction November that I would do a video compiling some of my all-time faves. The majority of these, as I'm sure you can guess, are going to be historical nonfiction. In fact, I think they're all historical nonfiction, and they are also basically all biographies. And I decided to kind of put a stipulation on myself that I could only talk about more modern nonfiction that's been published in the past 100 years or so. That may mean that a video all about classic nonfiction should probably come soon. But this is all of the modern nonfiction published in the 20th century and beyond that I have rated 5 stars. And some of these have been extremely formative texts for me, and they have kind of defined some of my favorite research topics. One of the first ones that I want to talk about lives up here on my reference shelf, and the majority of the books that you see behind me on a regular basis are books that are my all-time favorites, particularly up here. This is all nonfiction for the most part, aside from my Iliad, Odyssey, and Aeneid. But this stack right here, some of my all-time faves. I mean, a Dante biography that I love, The Ugly Renaissance by Alexander Lee, Viking Britain by Thomas Williams. That could be a video in and of itself, but I feel as though I have talked about those books enough elsewhere. But one book that lives up here is a book that I don't talk about often enough, and it's largely because scholarship has just outpaced it. This is a really old book, and it is one of the first books that kind of changed public opinion about a very controversial historical subject. That is Richard III by Paul Murray Kendall. This came out back in the 50s, I believe, and it was one of the first modern nonfictions to look at Richard in a very nuanced light. It did not discuss him strictly as a villain. It did not look at him purely through the lens of Shakespeare. And so there was a lot that was done here that was pretty groundbreaking in terms of scholarship of the Wars of the Roses and about Richard in particular. This is, to this day, the only biography of Richard that I've actually read completely. And there's just something about his writing. I think there's a reason why I just took to this. Most modern scholarship about Richard now focuses on the discovery of his body, and also really just in general focuses on the Wars of the Roses. I haven't read a really great biography of Richard in a very long time, and so I'm always on the hunt for one, because really in the end, something this outdated is not the one that I should recommend people start with Richard, but it's where I started, and I personally think you could do worse. You do have to keep in mind when you read this that, of course, we know so much more today than Paul Murray Kendall knew at the time of writing this. And in fact, I think he has updated this a couple of times. But this was written long before the discovery of Richard's body. So that is something to keep in mind. Those details will not be discussed here at all. But I personally just really love this biography. This is one of my all-time faves. Another of my all-time favorite biographies is Napoleon the Great by Andrew Roberts. This is a book that I just went out on a limb with. I took a chance on, and it completely blew me away. I became completely obsessed. This book is the reason that 2021 wound up being the year of Napoleon for me, and I read books about Napoleon. I read Napoleon's favorite books. I just really spent a year with Napoleon as a figure. And before picking this up, I had always thought that I would not like Napoleon. Do I like Napoleon? That's still up for debate, but I felt like I wouldn't even enjoy learning about him because I view Napoleon as strictly a military figure. And since I am not really a military historian, that's not where my interest lies. That's not what I like to read about. So I've always viewed Napoleon as someone that I just would never really be interested in learning more about. And this biography proved me wrong. I mean, instantaneously, it introduced you to Napoleon the bookworm, Napoleon the nerd. And that automatically disarmed me, and it made me get to know Napoleon as a person long before he became the emperor. And thus, I felt a real connection with him throughout every step of his life while reading this biography. This biography is so brilliant because it allows you to get to know Napoleon on a personal level before he ever becomes larger than life. And so you have become attached to him, you have gotten to know him as he starts to do the really big, massive, famous things that he's known for. And so it feels a bit like, oh, I knew him when. And that is the mark of a brilliant biography to me. I should walk away from most biographies feeling like the figure is my friend. And I felt like that about Napoleon. This is one of my favorite nonfictions of all time because it truly turned my expectations on their head. And it made me really reevaluate my relationship with military history, with modern history. I just had a great time with this. Finishing out a trifecta of biographies about really controversial historical men. I also love Robert K. Massie's Peter the Great. This is one of my favorite Robert K. Massie books. Robert K. Massie is just an amazing historian, and his books read very much like fiction, and they have kind of a narrative to them, which I think makes them really great beginner's works if you just want to get into nonfiction. Peter the Great is an endlessly fascinating figure to me. He is one of my favorite Romanov characters. He's just a very interesting person. And this biography really showcases that. But it's interesting that as a biography, this doesn't necessarily focus on him purely. It focuses on the evolution of Russia under Peter the Great's reign. And that is what makes this one really interesting, and that's what makes this one my favorite of Robert K. Massie's that I've read. I always have to tell this story whenever I mention Peter the Great. I'm not really sure why. But a few years ago, I visited Paris and I went to Saint-Denis, which is one of my favorite churches I've ever been in. I mean, we could talk about Saint-Denis for days. But Saint-Denis is really famous as being the burial place of most of the French monarchy. And they actually had a traveling exhibit on that had to do with the deaths of other famous monarchies in the world. And they had the death mask of Peter the Great on display. And what was so interesting about this is that it was in kind of like an alcove in the basement of the church. And they had like a front piece that was talking about who Peter the Great was. This is really why I picked up this biography, because I saw his death mask. The front was just like a bio of Peter the Great, and the mask was hidden behind it. And I just thought that was bizarre. I thought that was a really weird layout for an exhibit. And so I'm walking around not realizing that that's actually where the death mask was. It was one of the most terrifying things I've ever seen, the death mask. It was just like this really ghost-like mask that they had kept in complete darkness with the barest amount of light on. It was truly like really, really scary. And I said, okay, they had to put this behind the biography because people just walking along in the crypt would have been scared out of their minds if they turned and looked and saw that. Anyways, that led me down the deep, dark rabbit hole to find out more about Peter the Great because of his traveling death mask. And so this is one of the best biographies I've ever read. I really thoroughly enjoyed this. A good biography will make you interested in somebody that you might not have been interested in otherwise. And I don't know that of everyone in Russian history that Peter the Great would have been the one I was most intrigued by. And he wouldn't have been my first choice for a biography. But when I read this, I became very fascinated by him, and I instantly saw why he needed a biography this size. A really great biography should also open your mind. But that kind of finishes my trifecta of controversial men. Peter the Great is an interesting biography because Peter the Great as a person sometimes takes a backseat to the narrative of the formation of Romanov Russia. And I personally think that's really interesting, and I think that's a great technique for biographies. Another biography that does this incredibly well is Stacy Schiff's Cleopatra. This is one of the greats. I mean, this is truly one of the greats. And people either love or hate this biography, and I can see why. Akin to Peter the Great, parts of this are not really about Cleopatra. The majority of this book juxtaposes the culture of Alexandria and Egypt to Rome of the 1st century BC. Rome of the 1st century BC was not the greatest place on earth, let's just call it like that. But Alexandria in the 1st century BC, it was up there. It was definitely one of the places to be. So this book uses Cleopatra as a vehicle to discuss Alexandrian culture, and Roman pilfering of Egyptian antiquities, which I thought was very, very interesting, but it also is just a great biography of Cleopatra. Cleopatra is one of the most interesting people who has ever lived. She has to be one of the smartest people who ever lived. Sadly, there's not a lot about her we can know for certain because the majority of the people writing biographies about her were Romans, and so they had a vested interest in making Caesar sound good, in making Augustus in particular sound good. And so you have to kind of take the ancient biographies with a grain of salt. And this biography, I thought, did a really wonderful job at showing you the context for Cleopatra's life and discussing the rumors about her and how the rumors about Cleopatra are at this point synonymous with her historical reality. And that's a very hard place to be. I really love that. That's one of my favorite things in history, is to discuss the intersection of myth and reality. Because at what point is the story that you know, the story everyone knows about someone, at what point is that story more important than what actually happened? Cleopatra is a wonderful figure to discuss that with. So this is another of my favorites, and I think it's a great beginner's book for nonfiction. If you are kind of scared of nonfiction, you think it's going to be dense, this one is just so readable. I feel like it's a natural segue from Cleopatra to move into another of my favorite female figures in history, who also, weirdly enough, is plagued by a lot of myths and stories about her that are likely not true, and that is Marie Antoinette. My favorite Marie Antoinette biography is by Antonia Fraser. I will always have a soft spot for this book because it is, to my memory, the first nonfiction that I ever read fully on my own, that I wasn't reading for school. And I read this when the 2006 phenomenal Kirsten Dunst film came out, which was based on this book. So I was reading this at the ripe age of like 13, and I thoroughly enjoyed this. I have always adored Marie Antoinette, and I always will. I just love her, and I think this is a phenomenal biography because it does so much to make you sympathize with her. I think people used Marie Antoinette as a scapegoat, right? We want to blame somebody for this, and Marie Antoinette's ideal. She's not from France, and she also really doesn't have a lot of political power, so we can blame her for spending all of the money. And this biography does so much to reframe how public perception of her changed across her reign with Louis XVI. Because we in the modern day can reframe everything about that she is a foreigner, that she has no political power. We view that as she's a victim of circumstance. Really, what else could she have done? But to the people of France at the time, there's a lot she could have done. And so this book discusses public opinion about her, and really famously, like the most beautiful moment where she comes out and bows to the women when they are coming up to Versailles, when she comes out onto the balcony and bows to the women. That is one of the most moving passages I have ever read in nonfiction. I truly love this book. I'm due for a reread of it. I would love to read another biography of Marie Antoinette. Probably the one by Stefan Zweig is the one that I would really like to pick up, because Stefan Zweig was Austrian, I think. So I feel like he would have the Austrian background for her. I find Marie Antoinette endlessly fascinating. I think some people believe she's been overdone. We talk about her too much. There's never enough talking about Marie Antoinette, to be frank. So this one will always have a special place in my heart, just as one of the first nonfiction books that I ever read. And I still have a fondness for Marie Antoinette that will never go away. I just truly love her. Another of my favorite ladies of history. We have to talk about my favorite book of 2020, Romantic Outlaws by Charlotte Gordon. This is a dual biography of my queen, Mary Shelley, and her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft. This is a banger. This is truly the most masterful piece of nonfiction I have ever read. This is my absolute favorite. I was blown away by this book. And a lot of it is because I went into this apparently blind and knowing nothing about Mary Wollstonecraft for certain, but also knowing less than I thought that I knew about Mary Shelley. So a lot of this book felt like it was just brand new information to me. Speaking of moving passages in nonfiction, I actually cried when I finished this book because it felt like I was losing a friend. This is what I'm talking about with biographies. They should make you feel a connection with the person. You should walk away from that biography having a new friend. And this one was special for me because it wasn't as if I just had the new friend for the book, which was kind of how Napoleon the Great felt. I walked away from this with my friend for life, Mary Shelley. I love her. I have now read several biographies of her. I have read her journals. I have read most of what she has written. She is now, for me, genuinely alive in a way that a lot of these people are not. Sometimes biographies put you at arm's length from someone, and they do make you feel as if, yes, I'm reading a historical text. I'm reading a book about somebody who has died. I have never felt like I was reading about a more alive person, a person that I could truly speak to than when I read this book, and it felt like Mary Shelley could have stepped off the page and shook my hand. Some of this is down to Charlotte Gordon's absolutely masterful writing, but this is a dual biography, and it was also about Mary Wollstonecraft, but I didn't walk away from the book with the connection to Mary Wollstonecraft that I now have to Mary Shelley. So some of it is definitely Mary Shelley coming through. But this is a very personal biography, and a lot of it is because Mary Wollstonecraft and Mary Shelley were very emotional people, and they kept a lot of records. They kept a lot of diaries. And so it feels like you get to know them so well through this book in a way that maybe you don't most other biographies, because so much of this biography pulls from their actual words. This is the masterclass. I mean, really, this is my favorite. And so I do highly recommend this. Even if you don't think that you're interested in Mary Shelley or Mary Wollstonecraft, trust me, you are. They really lived incredible lives. Let's round out the biographies with one that I think we have to talk about, and that's Alexander Hamilton by Chernow. This is a very well-known biography, and it should be. This is one of the best. This one gets you right off the bat. The introduction is so emotional that you really are automatically in for the long haul. This is possibly the longest nonfiction of my favorites, but it did not feel like it. This was just an utter joy to read. And I have a soft spot for the American Revolution. I really, truly do. And I try to keep in mind that maybe not everybody wants to go into the level of detail that I do about the American Revolution, but this did not feel very long to me at all. And it's another one that felt quite personal. I feel like there was something about this time period, because Mary Shelley also lived at this time, Mary Wollstonecraft and Mary Shelley, the late 18th, early 19th century, where people were just really putting their emotions down on the page. They were really keeping diaries. They were really emotional in their letters. And so you go throughout this biography knowing precisely how Alexander Hamilton felt at different points in his life. This most famously inspired Lin-Manuel Miranda to write the Hamilton musical. And I think what's so interesting is that he pulled from this biography a very interesting point about Alexander Hamilton that we would not know very much about him at all were it not for his wife, Eliza Hamilton. That is one of the main points of the musical, is Eliza's importance and what Eliza does for historical remembrance, not only for Alexander, but also for many of the other founding fathers. She was a key figure in like getting the Washington Monument started. She was a very pivotal person in early America that we do not talk about enough. And this biography does a lot to highlight her at the same time as highlighting Alexander Hamilton, who was another of the geniuses of history. This one is on a lot of people's favorites list, but there's a reason for it. It truly is great. A couple of random nonfiction books that are not technically biographies. Some of these are about a group of people, and some of them are about events. But one of my favorite historians of all time is John Julius Norwich. If I could only pick one book of his to recommend, one book of his is an all-time favorite, I would pick Absolute Monarchs, which is his history of the Papacy. John Julius Norwich is really good at this type of nonfiction where you kind of encompass a large span of time where you go across many centuries and you cover many different people. Another of my favorites of his lives up here. It is A History of Venice, where he covers the entire history of Venice in like 400 pages. I never feel as though he has condensed things down too much. I feel like he really does give each subject the appropriate amount of time. In Absolute Monarchs, I do wish he would have shown a little bit more of the medieval papacy, because I personally find that most interesting, and it was crazy. It was a crazy time. We had anti-popes. We had a pope in Rome and a pope in Avignon, so I can see that maybe in the end, the medieval papacy should have been its own book. But this is a really fantastic read, and it covers the entire line of the papacy from St. Peter up to the time when this book was published, which I feel like was in the 90s. This one is just an utterly fantastic read. I think John Julius Norwich is one of the most readable modern historians, and he had an incredible trilogy on the Byzantine Empire. He has an incredible book on the history of France. Really, everything he did was brilliant, but this is my favorite of his. Staying in Rome, another of my favorites is Rome, A History in 7 Sackings by Matthew Kneale. This is the most fascinating history of the city of Rome I've ever read. It tells you the history of Rome through 7 very important sackings of the city. Rome was sacked far more than 7 times, but there were 7 really big ones from the Gauls in the 3rd century BC up to the Nazis in the 1940s. So this one really covers a really long span of time, around 2,000 years, and it is genuinely fascinating. I learned so much through this book that I did not know. This book is the one that taught me that the Colosseum was used as an apartment complex in the medieval period. I never knew that. And I still think that is the wildest bit of trivia that I know, is that the Colosseum was at one time used as an apartment complex, specifically in the 1000s, which is when Rome was sacked by the Normans. I really enjoy reading about the sackings of Rome because I've always found, particularly in the ancient period, I love to learn about the barbarians. There's something about them that's just really fascinating to me. 3 of the sackings were in the Republic and Imperial era of Rome, and the rest were in the medieval, Renaissance, and more modern periods. And I just think this is a really fascinating book. Akin to that fact about the Colosseum, there were just so many little tidbits like that that now live rent-free in my mind and are some of my favorite bits of trivia that I know about the city of Rome. This one was just a delight, and it was one that I didn't really expect much from when I picked it up. So this is one that was a total surprise to me. Last but not least is a book that I have talked about on my channel before, but I feel like it was many years ago. And this is Washington's Spies by Alexander Rose. This nonfiction book is about the Culper spy ring in the American Revolution. This book, I think, famously inspired Turn, which was a television show that was on for a few years that focused on the Culper spy ring. The Culper ring was a spy ring put together by George Washington, and throughout the American Revolution, they ran information for him. Most famously, they were involved in revealing the treachery of Benedict Arnold and the subsequent execution of John Andre, who was a British spy. This is really fascinating because it is everything you want a book about spies to be. They wrote in invisible ink. Incredible. Like ink that you had to hold over a fire to reveal a hidden message. There were a couple of women involved in the spy ring, actually. One has never been decoded. This is the most interesting thing about them, actually, is that no one knew their names until the 1930s, when the code in some of the Culper ring letters was finally cracked and they could match names to the numbers. They went under numbers in the code. And so it's really interesting. A lot of people in their own lives never knew that they were spies in the American Revolution. One woman would hang out a petticoat of a certain color on her laundry line to signal things to other members of the spy ring. And the best thing is, this spy ring was a group of childhood friends. Ben Talmadge really put this together. Ben Talmadge was an American officer in the American Revolution, and he was very close with George Washington, and he was also very close with Nathan Hale, who was most famously executed early on in the American Revolution for being a spy. He's the one that said, I only regret that I have but one life to give for my country. And so Benjamin Talmadge got involved in espionage because of Nathan Hale. This is one of my favorite stories of the American Revolution because it just beggars belief. No one knew that they did this, and they were a group of friends who'd known each other since they were kids. And no one knew that they did it. They were able to keep everything completely secret. Nobody was ever found out. I mean, it was just a genuinely amazing story, and the American Revolution is filled with things like this. The Culper Ring is really fascinating, and this book is one of my favorites because it was the first time I was ever introduced to the concept of them, it seems like. So I do highly recommend this, especially if you were at all interested in espionage. There are so many other books that I could have included in this list, and I know that I'm going to be mad when I start editing this and I realize just how many I've forgotten. But those are my favorite nonfiction reads. I would love to know down below if you have read any of these, and I would love to know what your favorite nonfiction reads are down below as well. But that's going to be all from me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.